In a very dark and humid dungeon with large stalactites and stalagmites, everything was filled with mystery and the anticipation of another battle. The group of warriors could barely move as their unit had already lost a significant number of fighters. The mages illuminated the passage and they moved forward, step by step, toward their main destination. Exhausted from his wounds, one of the warriors fell again and lost consciousness. One of the team leaders said that if that happened, Hiller wouldn't have enough mana to heal them all. Are they doomed to die here, underground? He was sharply interrupted by his colleague to stop him from talking nonsense. Barely regaining consciousness, the young man smiled, looked at the commander of this group, and said hopefully that they still had a long way to go. He was a real hero, a man with a huge sword, in shiny and expensive armor, who showed complete confidence in his appearance. In a loud voice, he told them that since they had the energy for idle chatter, it wasn't that bad, that they should hold out a little longer. The warriors happily replied that they would try. To himself, this warrior thought this was a bad thing, because his team was beginning to worry. There were 74 of them in this raid to begin with, but after many battles with huge monsters, there were only 43 left. He gritted his teeth in annoyance. But the important thing is not that we lost 31 men, but that 43 fighters still have their hearts beating. He comforted himself with this thought. And despite their best efforts, they could not protect 31 comrades in this unequal battle with a huge number of flying monsters. But they were ready for it, because they were in one of the 7 dungeons of the Great Evil. It was one of the most important caves in all of humanity. Brightly colored flying orbs of magic illuminated the warrior's path. The young man looked up to survey the vast expanse of the dark dungeon called the Primordial Core. A member of the group approached our commander and told him to pay attention to the gigantic passageway that lay directly in front of them. At last we have reached the end of the Primordial Core, the brave warrior thought to himself. Without a second thought, they stepped forward into this dark and ominous, mysterious room. The end of the adventure, after all the sacrifices, is a place that holds an unimaginable amount of treasure. Maybe even along with 36 masterpieces of the greatest works created by mankind. Besides, the boss lives here, so everyone has to be careful. And in the next second, the leader of the group grabbed his sword. He shouted loudly to the rest of the team to line up in battle order and take their positions. The mages had to light the area, visibility was needed. Everyone froze and not a sound was heard. The noise stopped. At this time, the mages created more glowing orbs to increase their range of vision. Everyone must be on their guard. There had never been so much light in this dark room, so they had a good view of everything that was going on here. But in the next second, something amazingly terrifying happened. The huge monster opened its eyes. And they were the eyes of the beast, which glowed brightly from the unusually large amount of light, showing with its entire appearance that it was simply gigantic in size. At what he saw, our knight's eyes widened with fear, and a cold sweat ran down his back. In the next second, he saw countless sharp fangs of this huge monster opening its mouth. No one could even move, everyone stood like a stiff-necked man. Suddenly, someone shouted, "Run, he can't be killed." And now we are transported to another place, where a skeleton in armor communicates with his friend like a true psychologist. A bunch of humans came in while you were sleeping, but despite your fatigue, you fought them honorably, he told someone. Did I hear you right? The giant replied, yes, you did. It was the same monster that had frightened all of our team members, causing them to run away. Compared to this insignificant skeleton, a huge creature lay proudly on the ground with its paws spread apart. This amazing creature said that both humans and his own body were against him. He asked his friend to calm down and take it easy, but he didn't even think about stopping. How could he calm down after such a prank? After all, this creature is the dungeon boss. And when all those people came, he was asleep, but he had to be on his guard, not wait for them to come right at him. And all he had the sense to do was just yawn at them. Is this really how it's supposed to be? Skeleton wondered. You lack basic discipline. He began to shout loudly, and his voice was very stern. Discipline, you know. Then he turned aside and looked at the girl to get her opinion on the situation. Slowly raising her eyes, she softly said that this creature was able to stun people just by yawning. The girl was once again amazed by the majesty of this huge monster. She came closer, and even from a distance, this skeleton could tell that she was crazy about this creature. She's completely in love with him. Very frustrated, our skeleton sat down on a chair and realized that it was time to get over it. Then, with sadness in his eyes, he declared that this dungeon was over. The huge monster reassured him. He asked him not to worry so much, because the extra nerves could make his health deteriorate. One of the 7 dungeons of great evil that humanity has no hope of conquering is the primordial core. Most dungeon raids end with humans winning. The position that monsters should always be ready to block humans who can attack at any moment is completely unfair. In the end, it is the dungeons that become weaker as the war goes on. However, in a world where countless dungeons are being conquered and appearing, it is only natural that there will be an exception that cannot be conquered. A dungeon of immense evil, or rather, 7 dungeons of immense evil that are considered beyond the reach of humanity. Of the 7 great evil dungeons, the primordial core is the most complex demonic one. It is inhabited by dozens of alien creatures that guard the place. And gatekeepers guarding the 3 crossroads. A homunculus guards the red path on the left. A skeleton guards the blue road in the middle. Exact information about the contaminated road on the right is not yet known. And this whole impregnable fortress is ruled by the primordial monster that appears in the first chapter of the imperial mythos. That's what the book said. The girl covered it with her hand and tied a golden ribbon around it. Just as you said, dear monster, after such books spread among humans, the number of people who wanted to enter the dungeon increased. She was crouching in her beautiful maid's dress, holding a book in both hands. To which the monster replied, you need brains to run a dungeon. Being mystical and mysterious is not an option, people won't even try to come here. The giant monster rejoiced like a little child who had just been read an interesting fairy tale. He went on to say that we should tell a little bit of the truth so that people would think, we know exactly how things work there. So as soon as they saw a little book describing the laws of the dungeon, albeit half-fictional, they rushed to it like moths to a flame. After some thought, he continued, I didn't expect such a crowd, there were quite a few this time. In his memories, he saw the huge pile of defeated warriors again. How many were there? 74. He asked as if to himself. Yes, but most of their equipment melted when they fought my giant black tentacles, so those warriors were useless. And quality equipment is quite expensive, he concluded. The girl whispered quietly that she could easily kill those warriors with her own blade, and the monster nodded in agreement. Then this huge monster began to whirl around the room and a large ball of energy formed right above the girl's head. In the next second, its hands gradually appeared and it took on a humanoid form. As if coming down from on high, he placed his right hand on the girl's head and gently stroked her, reassuring her that she could take care of herself. She was very pleased to receive such attention from the dungeon boss, and she blushed with embarrassment. But suddenly they were interrupted by a death knight who declared that this was not a conference and that they should stop having fun. He had no way of knowing why they were still partying as if nothing had happened. He grinned at them and jokingly said that they were such a cute couple that he might soon have cavities. And that not only would his teeth rot, but also his head. Then he asked his boss to change his body properly and do it normally because he had just caressed a girl's head with his 6-fingered hand. The young man stared in surprise at the hand with more fingers. Indeed, there were 6 of them. Nothing gave him away as a dungeon boss. He was a well-built young man in civilian clothes. Knight continued to compliment him, saying that the boss was making progress. Last time, the sight of 40 teeth had given him goosebumps. When he smiled brightly and said the transformation had been successful. This annoyed the girl, who told the skeleton that the sound of his chin rattling was too loud. He was taking the boss's attention away from himself. The skeleton thought that he should get rid of his position as dungeon gatekeeper as soon as possible. Afterwards, they had a small meeting and discussed current affairs as if they were sitting in an office. Joyfully, the blade-wielding maid reported that finally, people were starting to cross the right-of-way. Of course, everyone knew that. The problem was that Mr. 116 Black Tentacles was badly injured. The wounds looked quite critical. The young man, who had been a monster not long ago, replied that there was no need to worry too much because the regeneration of tentacles was much faster than they thought. He said we'll have to wait a while, and if things don't improve, we'll find a replacement gatekeeper. The skeleton shouted that if he was going to look for a replacement, he should look for 2 at once. He wants to resign. What are you talking about? You have a contract for life, the young man said in surprise. Anyway, from now on, the people's path would only be the right one, he said confidently. Everyone listened intently to their boss. The skeleton added that people might already be forming new teams. The girl added that these days, people use communication magic like telepathy quite extensively, so the information that there was a chance on the right polluted path might have already spread. The young man slammed his palm down on the table and said that they would have to plan their strategy accordingly and switch positions to better repel the human attacks. And since the girl had previously defended the left red path, from today on she would defend the right path. He continued, people will think that the right way is free, and they will go there. You'll show them. The girl shouted enthusiastically and joyfully that she would defend the dungeon no matter how many humans invaded it. Then he turned to the skeleton and said that the way the maid had protected was now his. Surprised, the skeleton didn't understand why he had to do this now. However, his boss explained that if people found out that it was him standing on the polluted path, they would take the red path that she had originally defended. That's why he's going to meet them there. He seems to have planned everything very well. He clapped his hands and concluded that they could defend themselves against 2 invasions at once. Skeleton had something to add and interrupted him. And if the people take the middle blue route, what then? The boss didn't seem to have thought of that. There was a pause and everyone fell silent. With a caustic smile, he said quietly that people would then have a chance to have a date with him. The skeleton lowered his head and said quietly that this was a sloppy strategy. However, the girl did not share his words and was pleased with her boss' strategy. She continued to lead the meeting. Now that they had dealt with the more pressing matters, the only thing left to decide was what to do with the sword. The young man, already quite tired, asked her again what sword she was talking about. It seems that the guys who broke into their dungeon last time were quite strong, since they carried such a sword. Everyone was curious to know what kind of sword it was. Here it is, the skeleton said cheerfully, holding the hilt of this huge sword with his bony hand. It is one of the 36 masterpieces. It is very popular among people. It was a perfectly formed blade, very sharp. And the steel shone very brightly in the light, reflecting the dazzling light. There are also masterpieces that are not weapons. All in all, this sword seems to be the 14th sword among them. And it's called something like Tanabello. The skeleton finished his story. Leaning back in his chair, the young man scratched his head and remembered that he had heard about something similar before. I believe there were similar swords in the dungeon. He added that this girl's blade was also one of the 36 masterpieces. She was holding this beautiful horseshoe-shaped knife in her hand. Then the boss added that he thought people were starting to walk around with pretty good weapons. What will they do now? The knight figured that if they gave this sword to the fighters at the entrance, the men could overpower the guards and take the sword for themselves. And then they'll be in trouble. So it's probably best to leave it here in this place. The young man then asked the skeleton if he was wielding a sword. Maybe he wants to take it for himself. He said that since the boss insisted, he would take the sword for himself. Even though it was all he'd been waiting for. This is the dungeon, this is the primordial core. It's the home of a terrifying blade-wielding homunculus maiden. A death knight who exudes the energy of destruction. And a giant ancient monster. The young man was barely on his feet. So he lay down on the table, showing that he was already tired of this meeting. He added that since the skeleton had gotten the sword, he could tear up the letter of resignation. Because he hid it between his ribs, and the boss knows it. It was a great team. A trio of interesting characters. A determined maid with a blade. The sole conscience of the dungeon in the form of a doom-bringing skeleton. A master of criticizing the boss. And the epitome of laziness, an ancient monster. And so they have all been fighting the incessant streams of warriors for years. Once again, our lovely trio gathered for another meeting. Boss, how are we going to distribute the remaining income? The girl asked the young man. While the skeleton didn't seem interested in their conversation, he was pleased with his new sword. Like the director of a large corporation, the boss replied, we will do as usual, take what we can and use the useless things as bait for the next group. Happy and smiling, the girl replied that she was satisfied with this arrangement and that she would take care of the details. The boss nodded. The girl added that monsters can't use magic weapons, maybe it's time to take off the magic stones and sell them, you could make a lot of money, she added. Surprised, the young man asked her again if it was true and they could make a lot of money. There was a pause, then he added, maybe I should go to town for the first time in a long time. In the next second, the two were alarmed beyond belief. They looked at him with wide eyes. The skeleton has no eyes, of course. A little startled by their reaction, he asked them why they were so surprised. They didn't seem to want to send their boss to the village at all. Skeleton suggested that the maid go. The young man asked again why they didn't want to send him alone. The skeleton replied that he was not good at transforming into a human. There's still a tail sticking out. In the next second, it was clear to everyone without words that a girl was going to the city. Okay, the boss added, the important thing is to grab a lot of goodies on the way. And in a moment, she was walking through the woods towards the village. She was wearing a dress, and nothing gave away her mysterious appearance, only a dark cloak that covered her entire head. The weather is not bad today, she noticed. Farewell, she turned toward the cave and said she would be back soon. After some time, the girl reached the village, where she went into the shop of an experienced jeweler, who carefully examined all the stones she had brought with her with a magnifying glass. I'm afraid we can't buy one of those, he told her. She stood there a little confused and didn't know what to say. Why can't you buy these stones? She asked him briefly. Her eyes glowed with a bright green light. The jeweler replied that he needed some time and went under the table. He pulled out a beautiful-looking blue stone and placed it in front of her. Here, look, it's a B-grade stone. We commoners have to work hard for 10 years to buy it. After that, he continued to explain. The stones you brought are much more valuable, you know. Such stones can only be used by Imperial Palace mages or high-level mages. Next to the stone he had just placed in front of her was a huge, beautiful-looking ruby, emerald, and the rest of the gems. The jeweler thought for a while, then added that such a stone might be bought by a jeweler in the capital who had an agreement with the imperial family, or the wizard's tower might be interested in such a stone. The capital and the wizard's tower, I see, the girl said. She thought that the capital was too far away for her, she would have to visit the tower. But it seemed that she didn't really want to go there, so she tied her bag with one hand. Nevertheless, she decided to do it for her boss. She said goodbye to the jeweler, who wished her to be more careful. As she was leaving, he called out to her that she had forgotten one of her jewels. She's obviously got a good jeweler. She turned in his direction and said quietly that it was his tip, then thanked him again and thanked him for the information. She called him a man. What a queer girl, the jeweler pronounced. She's human, too, isn't she? After a while, the girl reached the mage tower. It was a stately building, reflecting the taste, style, and wealth of its owner. She was met at the entrance by guards who advised her to see the guild leader if she wanted to sell her stones. She replied well and went forward. I will escort you to the office of our leader. Please follow me, one of the guards told her. With the lantern in his hand, he began to climb the long stone staircase to the top. The girl thought that at the top was the office of the head of the wizard's tower. And the shape of the building was no accident. This building resembled a dungeon in its structure. After a while, they reached the top and the girl approached the office of the guild leader. A beautiful young girl surrounded by her bodyguards greeted the girl and said with a smile that she was happy to see her. She introduced herself as the head of the Wizard's Tower Guild and was pleased by her presence. Behind her back was a large magic crystal. The head mage of the tower stood up and asked the girl who she was. The girl thought that this person had a lot of mana. Afterwards, the woman in the feathered hat added that when she was told that the tower was expecting a child, she thought she wouldn't even do it. But the guard told her that she had brought her a large number of mana stones. She asked her if she had heard anything about her tower. She really hoped that the stones she had brought were of high quality, up to the highest standards of her tower. Her eyes never stopped shining with a pleasant pink light. And in the next second, the girl suggested that she check the quality of the stones herself. She opened her bag and began to pour out a huge amount of beautiful gems onto the table. The guild leader froze in astonishment and couldn't say a word. She had never seen such a huge amount of gemstones before. These are A-grade stones, she thought enthusiastically. Afterwards, she picked up a few stones to examine them more closely. Some of them were of the highest quality. How could this little girl have so many treasures? She kept wondering in her head. Who is she really? The sorceress thought to herself. Then she asked the child a question. Where are you from, my dear? The girl remained silent for a while, but then the sorceress turned her attention to her hair. Among the 8 great families of the empire, there was one with hereditary silver hair. It turned out that the daughter of this family ran away from home and took the stones with her. There was no way she could explain to herself that the girl had brought such a large amount of mana stones with her. Anyway, she's a noble lady, she can't know how much they cost. She continued her mental analysis. The mage then interrupted the pause in the air and said she apologized for her earlier rudeness. She had not expected the stones to be in such good condition. She explained that her guild would like to buy them all. She then offered 50 ounces of gold for each. And they will offer a special price of 80 ounces of gold for the highest quality stones. All the while, her guest remained mysteriously silent, listening intently to this head sorceress. Meanwhile, one of the guards brought them 2 cups of hot tea. After a pause, the girl asked her if she was sure she wanted to give her 50 ounces of gold, remembering the words of the jeweler in the village shop who had told her that commoners had to work hard for 10 years to buy one of her stones. Typically, a person earns 10 ounces of gold in 1 year. 10 years is 100 ounces. Of course, this girl realized that she was being tricked, so she raised her eyes and looked at the sorceress with big green lights and declared, "Man, if you cheat me, you're gonna die." The sorceress froze and did not know what to say to her. She thought to herself that her trick had failed, and it seemed that this girl clearly knew what she was doing. Then she added, "To be honest, our guild doesn't have enough money to buy them all." "Then buy as many as you can," the girl replied sternly. After saying these words, the guild leader smiled. She opened a huge chest containing a large amount of gold coins. 2,000 ounces of gold is all we have, she said. The guild leader then offered her a new deal. She would like to exchange the remaining stones for something very valuable. The girl asked her if she was sure of the value of the goods, since they should be easy to sell. To which she received the affirmative answer that you don't have to worry about it. After that, the guild master pointed with her hand as if to offer her a way out, and told the girl to follow her. She will show her these precious items. The owner of this building added that the rules did not allow outsiders in here, but as an exception, she agreed to let her guest in. After a while, they were in the spacious room that was the storeroom of this tower. And she began to show her jewelry, which was of great value. It was a 4-carat diamond tiara with magic stones set in the center. Mages could certainly use one of these. Here's a special ring with living black pearls. If there is poison near the wearer of this ring, it will make a howling sound. These pearls were made by alchemy. The girl looked at the box containing the ring, but it was clear from her emotions that she didn't like everything she saw. Turning the conversation into a joke, the sorceress laughed and asked, "Didn't you enjoy it?" "After all, alchemy is an unhygienic science," she explained. "Of course I can understand your disgust." She then suggested that she turn her attention to a new topic. What will she say this time? It was a huge red heart-shaped crystal, reflecting the light brightly and glittering in the dim glow of the lamps. "The red stone of love," she added. "This diamond is said to make love come true." Having said that, she turned her head towards the girl with a smile, as if waiting for her reaction. The sorceress seemed to have found an approach, for the diamond that embodied love really interested the girl. She knew who she could use it on. In the next second, her eyes burned with a great desire to possess this object. Observing her reaction, the sorceress added that if she infused mana into this gem in front of someone she liked, the spirit residing in this precious crystal would establish eternal love between the two people. The girl interjected, "Between the two of them, really?" "Yes, I give my word as the head of the Tower Guild." The sorceress replied quickly and sternly. "Did you like it?" She asked the girl as if expecting some kind of reaction, realizing that she really needed such a diamond. Impatiently, the girl exclaimed, "Yes, I would like to take the diamond for myself." And as if continuing her subtle game, the experienced sorceress added that this gem could cause them a lot of trouble anyway. It can drown the emperor in the depths of worship and love. Therefore, she thinks it would be difficult to set a price for such a thing. It is a very expensive and valuable item. For a second, the girl was stunned, unable to find the right words, but in the next second, it showed her something the sorceress had never seen before. Her eyes were wide open and she couldn't believe that this little girl could have such an item. The child then added that with all the money she had received and the item she held in her hands, she would like to have the diamond for herself. She offered her rare weapon as ransom for a heart-shaped stone.
After a while, when the girl left, one of their alchemists approached the guild leader. Surprised, he asked her if she had really given the diamond to the girl. The guild master replied, "And what's the big deal? Yes, I did." Ignoring the questions from outside, she continued to look at the newly acquired stones and whistled a song. She was enjoying a job well done. The young man with a very worried face kept saying that she should realize what could happen to this girl. It's very easy to drive this girl to her death. So what? The guild leader replied briefly, looking at the precious object of interest through the magnifying glass once again. She didn't care about the fate of this little girl. The petty noblewoman wanted the diamond herself, she added succinctly. The young man continued to worry and said that she still shouldn't have done it. At that moment, the woman turned to him and told him to stop worrying, because she would die anyway once what was encased in the stone was released. The unfortunate girl's favorite person will also die, so there will be no evidence left. Making her way through a dense part of the forest, the little girl held on tightly to the bag that contained her most precious possession for the moment. Of course, a little pity for her beloved, added the guild leader of this tower. After a while, the girl reached a huge castle, an impregnable fortress perched high on a mountain. It was a gloomy building, and its appearance indicated that it was probably uninhabited. In a moment, the little girl was sitting in the hairdresser's chair of this castle. It was a woman with long, sharp, red-light nails, large scissors, and a mysterious image. She methodically continued to mow the girl down. It turns out that this is not the first time Our Lady has come to this woman for a haircut. She asked her to apologize for showing up so suddenly and bothering her with her visit. The woman replied that there was no need to worry and proceeded to cut her hair carefully. After all, they were neighbors and should help each other, she added with a smile. And how could she refuse to see her beautiful friend? It was the dungeon master of his castle. As she continued to smile, she didn't hide her sympathy for the girl and said that she sometimes envied her because the girl was a homunculus. After all, her beautiful face will never age, and she will always be young. The girl responded that she also looked very young and that her skin was much clearer and lighter than hers. But it turned out that the mistress of this castle was a vampire who used a lot of blood to maintain her splendor and beyond. Her guests wondered how she looked now, as if she was a little unsure of herself. According to this master of the castle, her friend looked stunning. She was the most beautiful she'd seen in a long time. She assured her that with her looks and new hairstyle, no one would dare turn her down. Our little maid blushed with embarrassment at such compliments. The vampire then asked her who she was dressing up for. Perhaps she was confessing her love to someone. The little person took out her beautiful heart-shaped crystal from her bag and said that she wanted to confess her great love to someone big. To the surprise of the lady of the castle, she said she was only joking and didn't believe the girl's words. But to whom did she want to confess her love? In the next second, the girl's eyes sparkled with thoughts of her lover, while the vampire looked at her somewhat discouraged and surprised. She didn't believe her own words. Was she really going to confess her love to this monster? Maybe this girl was just joking, she has a very good sense of humor, the woman added. Maybe it's because you're a homunculus? She asked her. A little irritated, the girl replied that she was not joking and that she would confess her feelings to this monster today. Like any good friend, she said that there was nothing to hold on to and that she didn't understand what she could possibly like about this monster. The young girl, completely ignoring her words, noted that her lover is nothing but the best because he has many good qualities. For example, he's very reliable. I guess I could agree with that. He's really good at it, the vampire added in a lowered voice. But at the same time, he's incredibly lazy. This monster is always sleeping. And as if she wanted to add positive qualities to her lover, the girl added that he is really big and lazy, eats a lot, sleeps and snores all the time, and often rubs his belly button, which has become very big lately. The older and more experienced vampire added that even though this girl knows everything, her heart is still drawn to this monster. Yes, I like him very much, the girl quickly added. The vampire came quite close to her and put her hand on her shoulder in a friendly way. She wished her luck, but still felt that this young person deserved so much more. Anyway, if he rejects her, she'll always be there to comfort her. She winked at her, and it was an understandable hidden subtext. The beautiful maid thanked her friend and continued to hold the beautiful stone to her chest. She kept it close to her heart, and never stopped thinking of her lover. And we are transported to the capital of the empire, a huge city with a big powerful castle, where very strong warriors and rulers live. A large and spacious room with a domed roof housed the joint command center of the dungeon raids. One of the men announced to everyone gathered that according to their intelligence, the heroes' team that had gone to this dungeon earlier had been completely annihilated. The people sitting around the table listened intently to his report. Then, one of them loudly thumped his palm on the table in anger and shouted, "What does that mean? Didn't he say that they would easily defeat the gatekeeper?" The others present at the meeting could not believe his words either. How could he be so sure of such a terrible outcome when the bodies had not yet been found? Another person began to loudly pound his fist on the table, claiming that the group leader couldn't have been killed by some monsters. Ignoring their emotions, the young man continued his report, convincing them that they did not understand how this dungeon worked. It's not as big and confusing as they think. This particular dungeon is one that either takes a day or doesn't come back at all. And since they haven't heard anything for the second 24 hours, things must be pretty bad. And most likely the group leader and the rest of the team are already dead. Only one of them seemed to believe his words. He said that maybe that was the case. But what about the sword the leader was carrying? Where had it gone? The young warrior replied that communication had been lost after the party had infiltrated the core of the ancient world. He believes that until they return to that dungeon and retrieve this 14th masterpiece, the sword can be considered lost forever. The man sitting across the table briefly replied that he understood. Those present were clearly not happy with what they had heard, and new emotions of incessant arguing began to ring loudly in the spacious room. How come we have to get him back soon, including the sword? There was no way that this group of warriors could not pass through the core of the primordial core. They felt that the number of casualties should not be increased and that it would be better to abandon the venture altogether. Opinions were divided. Some said they couldn't give up so easily. And if that warrior was fighting the boss, it's likely that the boss was seriously injured as well. Indeed, their warrior was a true hero. To which one of the men added that while they were talking, the dungeon boss was regenerating, and everything else in the dungeon was regenerating as well, so we need to get this over with quickly before their business gets really bad. A cold sweat broke over the man as he realized the full horror of what was happening. He held his head in his hands and thought that the imperial family had already lost their favorite hero and one of the 36 masterpieces. If the second dungeon raid failed as well, they would definitely all die. If they left things as they were, they would make the imperial family very angry and pay for it. But there was another possibility. What if this warrior couldn't inflict a single wound on the boss? What then? It didn't matter how many groups they would send on the next raid. After that, the man stood up and declared to everyone present that the primordial core dungeon was impossible to conquer. In the next second, all the men present were very confused after hearing these words. There was a pause, and they did not hide their worried faces. At that time, a young man approached them and asked, "What makes you think that?" He said that it was quite possible, and that they had a chance to win this dungeon. With some irritation, the head of the committee turned to the young man and asked him what the Imperial Magic Association was doing here, what they had to do with everything that was going on. To which the young man replied with a grin that he needed to know who they were getting all their business from. They were members of the Imperial Magic community called the Third Eye. The next second, the head of the committee started to sweat even more and thought that since they were here, the Emperor had already started to interfere with everything that was going on. The young mage told the men that their presence meant that it was time for them to pay for their sins and mistakes. Without hiding his irritation, he said with a malicious look that they were very foolish to lose a precious hero, so much so that they left a masterpiece in the center of the dungeon. The men bowed their heads, unable to find the right words to reply. Then the young mage approached one of them. He put his hand on the man's shoulder and said that even though they had all messed up pretty badly, if they were all noble, who would lead the rest of the raids? He told them that the mages had offered His Majesty a solution that could save their wretched souls. Then he loudly and joyfully announced that he had to go through the primordial core once more and descend into that cave. The head of the committee disagreed. How could they do it when even this mighty warrior couldn't? The young mage then spread his arms out to the side and loudly called out the name Nifrim. He told them that Nifrim would go with them. Nobody could believe his words. In fact, he said it right away. The man with the big mustache stammered his words and asked him how on earth they could send Nifrim when the last time had ended in failure, and he had too many problems. The young mage explained that Nifrim was not a failure, but a definite success. Then he leaned heavily on his right hand on the table and moved as close as possible to the committee leader. He looked the old man in the face and asked him a single question. Why was this protagonist and his party unable to escape from the dungeon? Could it be that they are very weak, or is it because they let their guard down? The next second, he was already sitting on the table talking to himself. No, it seems that all of these theories are untenable. What then? Why couldn't they? It seems that this warrior and his group had some kind of problem. A single big problem. The young man obviously knew what he was talking about and had a prepared answer. Because this warrior lacked what Nifrim had. Therefore, this raid will be successful. We return to the dungeon, where the boss sneezes loudly and for a moment his head loses its humanoid form. It seems that he wasn't without telepathic abilities either. He had a bad feeling. It's like something bad is coming. He kept sneezing and was thrown into the air from time to time. Maybe there's some kind of infection going around, he said to himself. In his usual lazy manner, the young monster continued to lie on the floor of his dungeon, unable to get up and do anything. He needed to start patrolling, but he was afraid that the skeleton would tell him off. This evil skeleton knight inspires fear, even though he is nothing but bones. Bones inspire fear. His words made the young man laugh. However, he decided that he would have no problem with the skeleton warrior, and after a quick jump, he was already on his feet. The last time, the humans had entered through a contaminated path. He decided to start with it. After a moment, he approached one of the guards of this dungeon, who spread his huge tentacles all around his large room. The young man examined him closely and noticed several wounds from the fights. Unfortunately, there was nothing he could do to help him, only to wait for the creature to regenerate. After that, he continued to explore the rest of his domain. He entered the fifth room of the dungeon, where a huge thorn bush-shaped monster with large thorns was spreading its leaves. With a quick jump, he climbed to the top of a huge tangle of intertwined branches to check on his monster's condition. The monster will continue to regenerate as long as it has a main body and nutrients. Yes, he checked to make sure it was okay. You can stay out of it and continue your patrol. He took a sharp leap forward from a great height and immediately landed on the ground, thinking that he had a problem. The reason was that rooms 1 to 4 were in ruins. It seemed worth discussing with the skeleton warrior, but the young man thought he would be told off again. In his usual manner, the next moment he yawned with boredom and thought it was time to rest and deal with everything else later. In his thoughts he praised himself for only looking at the contaminated path through which those disgusting humans had snuck in last time, well, and of course room 5. That's enough for today, we can get some sleep. But no sooner had he turned away and fled happily to his common room than a sound came from behind him. In the next second, a huge sword slammed into the stone wall, slicing it in half. This caused a reaction in his body, and he almost started to turn into a huge monster. Perhaps it was the filthy humans who had trespassed again. Well, if they decided to desecrate his dungeon with their presence, they would die here. But the next moment, he was surprised to see that they were not humans at all, but someone very familiar to him. As if on purpose, the young girl had created this situation in order to see her boss. She apologized to him, and told him that it seemed to her that some people were intruding and she wanted to deal with them. But it turned out to be her favorite boss, so she apologized to him again. To which the young man replied that there was no need to apologize so much, he was just a little scared. He immediately noticed her beautiful appearance and new look. He froze in surprise, for she was very beautiful. She had dressed up so beautifully, but for whom, he asked her. The young girl was very happy because she was noticed and paid attention to her appearance. Of course, who doesn't love compliments? He asked her if there was a big event coming up. After that, he was already worried that she might quit since she took off her maid's uniform, and for sure she wanted to do it before the skeleton warrior. The girl twirled the hair on her finger and said that there was indeed a very important event coming up. She said it in a low voice. But the young man seemed even more worried, and a cold sweat ran down his face. She asked him if he would give her some of his time. A single thought had passed through his mind countless times. Not the firing, not the firing. And after a moment she led him into her secret room, into the passage she had recently cut through, showing him that the place was now known to him as well. She invited him to sit down at the table, for she was going to make tea for them. As he slowly approached this festive table, the young man did not stop to think that perhaps the reason for this change in her behavior and appearance was a desire to quit. As usual, they chatted for a while over a cup of tea, laughing and smiling about various things. But then the girl decided to come to the point, and a red blush lit up her face. As he continued to drink his tea, the young man listened as she thanked him for taking her into his dungeon, and it had been 80 years since then. Does he remember that? Did he remember that day? Looking at his reflection in his cup of tea, he told her. Sure. He stammered his words a little, still worried about where she was taking the conversation. 80 years ago, dungeon raids were in vogue, and over 1,000 of them were destroyed. The number of people who had penetrated the primordial core exceeded several thousand. And since then, this girl has had her own nickname, because she was a treacherous, terrifying monster who ruined hundreds and hundreds of lives of brave warriors. Yes, of course I remember, said the young man. You did a very good job back then. By the way, how's your right eye? His cold sweat hadn't stopped. Looks like she won't be talking about stopping this time, he thought. The girl liked to talk about herself in the third person, so she told her boss that she was very happy that he remembered such an important day in her life. With an important look on his face, he leaned back in his chair, folded his arms across his chest, and said that he certainly remembered everything. And the girl replied that she was always there for him and was happy to help him. It's mutual, the young man replied succinctly. But he immediately stopped and realized that perhaps her words meant something. Why did she say she was happy? Words like that are said before saying goodbye, aren't they? He looked at her, and she came closer. Was she really going to tell him now that she was going to leave him? All he was thinking about now was her possible dismissal. The next second she looked at him with her big green eyes and told him how she felt and that she liked him. It was clear from his face that he hadn't expected to hear such words. He just froze and didn't know what to do. Finally, after 80 years, all this time she had kept her feelings inside and now she had spoken to him, and she was relieved. She was happy to let him know that she liked him and loved him. After he came to his senses a little and scratched the back of his head, he said he thanked her for her feelings. But they are always at the crossroads of life and death, and don't know when they might get hurt, don't know when they might die. She doesn't want either of them to spend the rest of their lives alone, does she? The girl clutched her dress and told him she knew this was how it would end. She knew she was asking the impossible. Still, she wouldn't be able to hide her feelings until the end of time. But when he turns his back on her and her confession means nothing to him, she'll do something interesting. And in the next second, her left hand is already reaching into her back to pull out something interesting. She can't survive if he rejects her. She held a large heart-shaped crystal in her left hand. She told him she would get his love any way she could. Yes, that's right, by any means necessary. Suddenly, she made a sudden movement, and came as close to him as she could. Of course, he was very scared. And in that second, her reaction was just the opposite. She was screaming, angry, and said that she would use any means, even the most insidious ones. All he had to do was wait, and she'd have his love. She held out the crystal to him and immediately told him that this was her chance to get it. The young man's eyes widened in horror. He realized that he had a difficult task ahead of him. And if you put mana in here, something terrible will happen. Literally in the next second, the teacup fell to the floor and huge swirls of dark energy began to spin around the room, scattering everything in their path. The young man could barely find his words and said that she was probably going to kill him now. A cold sweat broke out on the girl. She stood there, dazed with fear, not realizing what was happening. Is she really going to kill him? He asked her in a horrible, demonic voice that echoed loudly throughout the spacious room. He began to transform back into a huge, terrifying monster. The young girl was thrown aside in horror and dropped the crystal from her hands, which fell to the ground and shattered into small pieces. As she looked down, she saw that this once beautiful crystal contained an evil spirit of immense power. The skeleton was overjoyed at what had happened. The exhausted dungeon boss lay on the floor as the skeleton warrior ran around him. He was incredibly happy that his master had thrown the young girl out in a fit of rage. The monster wanted to ask him for advice, but the skeleton replied that he had created the problem, and now he would have to solve it himself. In the next second, the skeleton hand crushed the remnants of the stone, and said that it wasn't just the boss's fault for everything that happened. The skeleton slightly rebuked its master because he was also offended. However, the giant monster said that he didn't remember anything. What he heard made the skeleton angry, and he offered to remind him of everything that had happened. At the moment of danger, when the demon locked in the stone came out, the skeleton ran to his friend to comfort him. He repeated this over and over again to calm the boss down. However, the young man could no longer hear anything and gradually turned into a giant monster with 4 eyes. While the skeleton was trying to talk to the boss, the girl was sobbing on the stone, and her tears were falling on the rocky ground. The skeleton shouted at her to drop the stone and save herself, and he would take care of the rest. But he realized that she couldn't hear him now either, so the next second he drew his huge sword and struck her with great force, sending her flying to the other end of the room. Thus, he saved her from imminent doom and could now help his boss. By this time, the giant creature had already taken its final form and was talking to the skeleton. It seemed to want to kill him now, too, but the skeleton just slapped its palm on his skull. It appears that his boss now remembered everything and was ashamed. And while the monster burned with shame, the skeleton pondered why things happened the way they did. Frustrated, the boss realized that the girl was gone, and now she had to be brought back. The skeleton explained that they really needed her, and they couldn't do it without her, because she did everything in this dungeon: cooking, restocking monsters, resetting traps, as well as giving advice and handling complaints. She also did all the accounting in gold. They realized that they couldn't live in this dungeon without her. After that, the skeleton suggested that the boss find the girl by all means. Even if he had to get down on his knees and cry, the boss had to find the lost maiden. He changed back into a young man. The skeleton suggested that he take a magical item with him. It was a special demura that helped to maintain mana balance. It was an expensive item that even this boss had never seen before. And as long as the young man had 6 fingers on his hand again, this item would help him transform better so that he wouldn't give himself away in the company of humans. The dungeon master couldn't understand where the skeleton had gotten such a thing, as if he had prepared it beforehand. The dungeon boss liked the new item very much, and the skeleton asked to use it for its intended purpose. He said goodbye to the skeleton and started to depart, leaving the dungeon to him. As he left, the skeleton told him to return within 5 days because the human attack was imminent. The boss had to get back before the humans attacked, because if they took their place of power, the dungeon would be doomed. He has 5 days at most. The young man promised to return with the girl. The skeleton shouted at him that when the boss went to town, he should act normal so that people wouldn't recognize him as a monster. Turning around, the young man replied that if things didn't go according to plan, he would simply destroy everyone. Realizing that things were much more complicated than they seemed at first, Skeleton began to read the latest news in the newspaper. He learned that the girl had left her weapon behind earlier, and received a demonic stone in return. Her prank almost got her killed by her boss. The skeleton has an idea how she got the stone. If the boss finds out, he will wipe out every human on the planet. Now is not the time for such big battles, the skeleton thought, and started to read the newspaper. The next second, he was shocked by the news that the Dungeon Raid Joint Command Center would be passing the dungeon within 3 days. A complete nightmare and fear gripped him because he had recently told his boss that he had 5 days, but there was no way they would fit in 3 days. We are transported to the surface of Solar Earth, where the boss lies in a huge crater. Dust clouds were still in the air, and Boss realized that he had landed in the wrong place for the second time. He remembered the skeleton's words, telling him that mana was unstable and that it was best not to use magic. He observed the lack of balance, but decided to try again. And in the next second, he gave the command to teleport himself to the town where the girl had sold the stones earlier. We are transported to a dungeon where a brave group of warriors have reached the Demon Queen. Sitting on her golden throne, she promised them a glorious death. The warrior told her that they were an elite group, so she shouldn't be so cocky. They will dethrone her and make themselves famous across the continent. His words made the Demon Queen laugh, and she rose from her throne to prepare for battle. The next second, she had already cast her first spell and flew towards the warriors. They should be proud that they recognized her name, and now they will die. However, the leader of the group was not going to give up so easily and rush to attack. But no matter how hard he tried, he failed. At that time, the mage decided to help the group leader and entered the battle. The queen shouted that they were about to be burned alive and cast another magical power on them. Huge beams of energy began to destroy all living things around them. Before the leader of the group could think about it, a huge rock flew towards him in the next second. He barely had time to raise his sword as a shield. But in the next second, the queen managed to prepare a new spell and huge ice floes flew towards him. The warrior was able to dodge, and in the next moment launched another attack. He accelerated and threw a piece of a huge stone slab in her direction. The queen easily parried his attack and prepared to finish off the insolent man. However, her ice spears ran into a huge shield of magic. To her surprise, she found that the mage was still alive and helping his leader. She had already swung around for another attack and came quite close to the warrior. In an instant, her hand and his sword made contact, but in the next second, there was a huge crack in the ceiling and rocks flew down. Something hit the ground with great force, knocking the group leader and the demon queen to the side. Neither of them understood what had happened or who or what had appeared. As soon as the group leader got up, he said that he couldn't believe that someone could have come and helped him. The demon queen thought that help had come that had the power to destroy her castle. But who was it really? And once the smoke cleared and the dust settled, our main character appeared. It seems that he had the wrong address again and wanted to ask them where the city he wanted was. No one could understand who he was or what he was doing here. Two enemies from the past united in their anger against an uninvited guest. The warriors advised him to stay away from the demon queen since he was human. He looked at the girl and couldn't believe that she was a demon queen. He remembered that her ancestors looked very different, maybe it was a matter of changing generations. The queen began to threaten again that she would destroy everyone. Meanwhile, support in the form of new warriors had already approached the leader of the group. All were ready to attack the demon queen, but the young man stopped them with his hand. He tried to ask them where the city he needed was, but no one seemed to hear him and everyone was busy fighting. Clouds of smoke and dust swirled around our hero as he sat pitifully on the ground, unsure of what to do next. He seemed to be getting really fed up and frustrated. He needed to find the girl quickly, but he realized that there was no way he could make a deal with all these people. The warriors got quite close to our hero and began to harass him. And the next second, he told them to shut up, and then he started to turn into a giant monster. Terror and fear gripped these people, and they crawled across the ground, running for their lives. Each of them was destined to die, for there was no escape from his power. Stumbling and falling, they died instantly. After a while, he turned back into a calm, friendly young man. Much to the surprise of the queen, who had round eyes at what she saw. The demon queen held her wand in embarrassment, and realized that this man was very strong. In terms of mana reserves, he surpassed her strength. She seemed to be falling in love with him, and wanted to know more about him. She had many questions. She began to whirl and run around him, asking him many questions, while the young man stood silently in one place. It was clear from his expression that he was in no mood for conversation. The demon queen remembered that she had forgotten to introduce herself. With great pomp, she called out her full name and introduced herself to our hero. But what's our hero's name? She couldn't help but wonder. However, the young man was disgusted by her behavior and felt uncomfortable looking at her. He almost said his name, but immediately remembered the words of the skeleton who had advised him to be careful not to tell anyone his real name. He gave the demon queen his fake name, and said he was looking for his friend. Even though he made up a name that wasn't quite right, the demon queen paid no attention and was pleased. She wanted to thank him for his help in the battle, even though he had blown up half the castle. The young man covered his face with his hand. If it weren't for him, she would definitely get hurt, even though he didn't want to help. And since he saved her, she's now indebted to him, and willing to help him. Our hero gladly accepted her offer and asked her to help him find the town he was looking for. He thought she knew the name of the city, but the next second he could see in her eyes that she was crazy about him. Now he realized that not only did she not know the way to the town itself, but she did not even know the name of such a place. He asked her where the nearest town was, since he'd flown far enough. The girl told him the name of the nearest city, and the young man was horrified because it was a very distant realm. Our hero realized that an ordinary man would have to travel on horseback for 2 months to reach a city where the girl might be. He became very upset and lay down on the ground to the great surprise of the demon queen. But his new girlfriend suggested that he use a special teleportation center. He seemed to have never heard of it. She explained that it was a man-made invention created by magic and alchemy. This magic device forcibly creates magic to move through space. Now he was curious to know where this center was located. She replied that it was in the capital of the empire. After a while, our heroes reached the center of the city, much to the demon queen's delight. The young man was worried that he would not be able to find his friend here, but it was worth it to find out more about the place first. The demon queen enthusiastically offered her help and said that she would like to find the silver-haired girl together with him. Our hero wondered how she could leave her castle unattended. After all, she is his mistress. She was very pleased that he cared about her. She assured him that he could rest easy. After all, she is a demon queen and a creature born to rule, so the shape of the dungeon is irrelevant to her. Wherever she goes, wherever she is, the place becomes a haven for monsters. And those monsters are her army. The young man marveled at her ability to summon her warriors at any time. The girl exclaimed happily and replied that it was true. Though she had never tried it herself, her father had once been able to do similar things. Maybe it'll work for her now. With sadness in her voice, she informed him that unfortunately the castle her father had built had been destroyed, so there was no point in going back there. She told him that they were constantly visited by people who were stationed very close to the castle. It's really hard when the capital of the human empire is right in front of the castle. After that, she was happy again, and as if she was in a familiar place, she suggested to her friend that she go and get the information they needed. And after a while, they found themselves in a completely unexpected place for our hero. It was a large beer hall in the center of town, where men usually gathered in the evenings. The young man wondered to his friend what they were doing here, why they were spending so much time in this place. He didn't realize that this bar could provide them with useful information. For a while, it seemed as if the girl wasn't listening to what he was saying and continued to drink glass after glass. Then she informed him that he was completely ignorant of how people work, because there is a huge accumulation of information in a bar like this. All you have to do is look around and listen, and you can hear all these conversations. She reported that it is just a treasure trove of information. You just have to filter out what's important. The young man didn't understand how any conversations could be filtered out in such a din. His gaze turned to the blackboard where various announcements were posted. The girl exclaimed excitedly that this was the place she was looking for, where she could find announcements for dungeon raids. These were lists of teams participating in raids. This was done to prevent multiple groups from raiding the same dungeon. The young man thought this made sense, since there had never been multiple groups raiding at the same time. The girl explained to him that it would cause problems with the reward system, so no one did it. Of course, if several groups came together at the same time, they would have a better chance, but people get greedy, so this is what happens. The young man casually said that we are better off in this situation. The girl turned to him and asked, is he a dungeon monster too? A cold sweat ran down the young man's back. After such a question, she looked at him in surprise and couldn't understand it. After all, dungeon monsters couldn't just walk freely on the street like that. Okay, she, the mistress of the castle, could do such a thing, but him. The young man suggested that she just forget what he said, and the girl agreed, because he really has a lot of secrets, and she will not bother him with her questions anymore. Maybe he has his own reasons for withholding such information. The next second, our hero was drawn to a certain advertisement placed right in the middle of the board. It said that this was his home, i.e. his dungeon, and thankfully the group list was still empty, which meant that he still had some time. His friend was hovering near our hero, unable to see anything due to the young man's large stature. She also wanted to see the information he had just found. He took the sheet from the board and showed it to her. Her eyes widened in amazement. She exclaimed loudly that this was one of the 7 dungeons of the Great Evil. She raves and admires this dungeon, for it is her favorite. For the power of this dungeon was recognized even by the people. The girl held the piece of paper in her hands as if it were something special. Maybe it was because it was the strongest of the 7 dungeons. After that, she began to talk about this dungeon in very enthusiastic terms, and our hero stood there listening. In his mind, he was a bit at odds with her. He would say that he was just an ordinary host, not a ruler who suffered from the evil inhabitants of his dungeon. After that, the girl said that she would like to become stronger, and maybe by improving her abilities, she would be able to see the huge monster that lives there. Our hero looked at her with a stone face and realized that she was looking at him. That monster. As she drank another glass of beer, she thought that being the most powerful was a wonderful thing, and she wanted to be just that. Then she remembered her father, who was also very strong, a worthy demon king, not like her. However, there were men who were stronger than her father, and one such warrior was Byrne, a rather young hero. The young man pretended that he didn't understand anything and didn't want to meet this hero at all. However, some time ago, when he yawned after a nap, he just swallowed him. The girl told him about her dream that she had been thinking about for a long time. She didn't want to run a dungeon for the rest of her life. She just wanted monsters, attracted by her power, to start building dungeons for themselves. Emboldened by her own words, she turned to our hero and asked him what he thought. Yeah, great plan, very cool, he told her. But he thought she was still too young and stupid. After all, he had been like that once, but he couldn't remember when. There was a time when he led an entire army capable of dominating the entire world. At that time, he was more serious than anyone else about possessing the world's knowledge. There was even a time when he socialized with some people even though he thought they were insignificant. Unfortunately, after that, he went along with his emotions and gave them everything he had. But in the end, he drew the most important conclusion for himself. He realized that all this was going nowhere. So he just wanted to sleep. That was his life's purpose. In the next second, he could see the demon queen sleeping on the table, snoring. She didn't listen to him at all and had long since fallen asleep. The next moment, 2 men were chatting because one of them had forgotten to remove an old announcement with outdated information. Our hero turned his attention to their conversation. One of the men quickly ran over to the bulletin board and immediately posted new information that concerned our hero. If he hadn't, an inspector would have come and fined them. The most important information was that the difficulty level of this dungeon was similar to that of dungeons of immense evil, and only those who had experience in such dungeons or had been summoned for such skills were allowed to enter. It also said that the raid would begin within 72 hours of the date of the above quest. Nifrim was chosen to lead the group. It was morning in the city. The bright sun shone into one of the rooms of the cozy hotel. The Demon Queen slowly woke up and noticed that she had a very bad headache after yesterday. Still yawning, our hero approached her and asked how she was feeling. She replied that she couldn't remember what happened yesterday. But he barely had time to say that this was no surprise after so much beer before he was overcome by a slight horror at what he saw. In the next second, he had collapsed to the floor and was sitting there, staring at the girl with his eyes wide open. The girl didn't understand what was going on and asked him if he was okay. He thought to himself that perhaps his eyesight had deteriorated. Gathering his strength, he was able to ask her a question after a while. Why does she seem so insignificant to him? Indeed, a completely different girl from the day before peered out from under the blanket. It was a baby, basically. His words provoked a fit of rage in the young creature, and the next moment she was already flying towards him, relentlessly pounding on his chest with her fists, screaming that she was not petty, just younger. Doesn't he think he's being too rude? She asked him, but the young man seemed completely oblivious to her blows, curious to know why she had suddenly changed so much. Still slapping him hard in the face, she was able to tell him that she hadn't gotten any younger, but that until yesterday she had been a second version of herself so that the wretched humans wouldn't mock her. She paused for a moment and stopped hitting him. This current look is her very real first look. Already quite beaten, with a black eye and a bloody nose, the young man wanted to know if she was really in her true form now. The girl replied that she was. That's right. But not really. She was even able to joke about our hero's swollen face from the beating, asking him if he had eaten without her that night. Our hero grinned after saying that. The girl took back her words and screamed at him, explaining that the transformation was actually the magic of projecting one's future, which meant that when she grew up, she would be just as cool as the second version of herself. She immediately began to smile and laugh, and the young man replied that he understood, but continued to sit on the floor. The next moment she was yelling at him again. Did he really understand? The dungeon boss said yes, exactly, although he thought he had better not argue with her or she would hit him again. She was beyond furious because she felt he had misunderstood again. The young man interrupted her and said that she needs new clothes now. She can't go into town dressed like that. She asked him to stop treating her like a little girl. She would not forgive him. He briefly replied that he understood. Meanwhile, equally interesting events were taking place in the Count's huge mansion. A large group of warriors arrived at the very gates of this fancy house. It was a raiding party, and they were eager to see the Count. One of the warriors shouted for them to open the gate immediately and meet the group. They had come from another city, and their main goal was to conquer a powerful dungeon. But there was no street noise in the Count's study. He was curious to know who had sent the document. It turned out that this letter was sent yesterday, and it was signed in the name of the Third Eye, a magical unit under the imperial family. He was very angry at what he heard, and he clenched the paper in his fist with great force. It made him extremely angry that a dungeon raid above Birang needed the approval of the master of those lands first, and these people had just decided everything among themselves and sent him the final terms on paper. And he can't even refuse, because it's almost an imperial order. Turning to his assistant, he wondered what she thought of the situation. Would the troop really be able to pass through the dungeon this time? The girl just shook her head in silence, and it was clear from her reaction that she didn't believe in such an outcome. As if he had received a verbal answer from the girl, the Count rose from his chair and said, I have never heard of the leader of this group, Nifrim. In the man's opinion, they are too weak to pass such a powerful dungeon. What the hell do they think they're doing? The Count's indignation never ceases. If this group fails this time, his country will suffer greatly. Perhaps he should send a stronger unit first. He continued his mental analysis to find the best solution for himself. He was still pondering when his assistant turned to him and said that the Count could see the solution right in front of him. At that moment, the man immediately remembered the wizard's tower, where our missing girl had been some time ago, selling her gems. He thought to himself that this tower must have high-quality stones from somewhere. Of course, it was naive to think that this would contribute to their rapid reinforcement, but to raid such a powerful dungeon even with an A-class tower was truly insane. But maybe the rumors weren't false, and they are indeed very powerful, he thought to himself, a slight smile appearing on his face. What if only the most important monster was left in the way of the warriors who had fallen in this dungeon? He finished his thought analysis, and after a moment, he ordered his assistant to send the order to the winged tower immediately. They will promise them huge amounts of money and fame. The main thing is to get them through this dungeon first. But no sooner had they finished their conversation than in the next second someone burst into the room and loudly opened the doors. The guards could do nothing, and 3 men entered the room. In the lead was Nifrim, a warrior who asked if the Count was really in front of him, accompanied by other glorious warriors. He walked ahead with a confident stride. Outraged, the Count asked who they were, to which the young man replied that he was Nifrim. He called out to him at length, but no one answered, so he had to go in himself. Indignant, the Count asked him what they had forgotten here, even coming unannounced. But the young man didn't seem to pay any attention to his words, and the next thing he knew he was sitting in a fancy chair with one leg tucked behind the other. The warrior informed the Count that he should be aware of this, as they had already received the documents from the Empire. The warrior turned to the Count, and in the next instant his eyes lit up. He looked at him very angrily and asked if there was a reason why they weren't allowed to be here. After all, they were representatives of the imperial house. The Count lowered his eyes and said in a low voice that there was no such reason. He thought that the little warrior looked like he was about to pounce on him. The green-haired girl said that he had guests, so he should show some respect and bring them all tea, cookies and chocolate. All the while, the Count's assistant stood motionless, waiting for her master's orders. He told her to hurry up and do as they asked. As the 2 warriors made themselves comfortable on the couch and continued to eat chocolate chip cookies, the Count sat down across from them, and wondered what they were doing here, why they had come to see him. The young man replied that they were going to raid this dungeon. The Count, as if not realizing what they had to do, asked them if they really wanted to go there so soon, since the document had just arrived and they were already here. With a sarcastic smile, Nifrim replied that they wanted to start today, but they had some plans, so they would probably start their raid tomorrow. The Count wanted to buy himself a few more days, so he tried to talk them out of it. He suggested they rest for a while and said they shouldn't be in such a hurry. He promised them good shelter and also promised to throw a welcome party in their honor. The young warrior replied that he could take it easy since they were going to visit Wing Tower first. With a suspicious voice, the Count inquired why. Maybe they're going to see someone they know. The young man replied that not really. In the next second, his face took on a demonic look. With glowing eyes, he looked at the Count and said with a broad smile that they were going to kill everyone in this tower. The Count continued to act like a good actor, wondering what he was trying to tell him, why they wanted to kill everyone. The young man replied that the Count had too lax a guard. The mansion is easily bugged with magic, so he knows everything. They came all this way for that dungeon. Does he really think it's fair for someone to beat them to it? Therefore, those little pawns in the tower must be eliminated. The young man smiled after saying these words. The warrior told the Count that he preferred this situation because the strongest would go on this raid anyway. The man was ashamed of what he had done earlier, and turning away, he said he would not give the task to anyone else, so they could still leave safely today. Biting off another chocolate chip cookie, the young man thanked the Count with a smile and said he was very generous. At that moment, the sound of sword strokes could be heard in the dungeon. The skeleton warrior continued his training, smashing huge stone statues to pieces with his big sword. He realized that time was running out, and the dungeon boss and the girl were still gone. After a while, the dungeon boss and his companion were already outside. The young man was still very sleepy, and his partner was ready for a new adventure. Our hero turned his attention to a huge passage in the wall. It reminded him of his dungeon. They approached one of the warriors and asked him how far it was to the teleportation center. The warrior put his business aside and said that they were only at the exit by the fourth wall. So they have a long way to go to reach the center. The place they need is near the Empire, and it is far away. They still had 3 walls to go. With excitement in his voice, our hero asked how long it would take. The warrior replied that if they walked, it would take about a week. The next second, our heroes were struck with horror at the realization of this fact. They couldn't believe it would take them that long. Our hero thought to himself, "This is taking too long. At this rate, the skeleton warrior will run after the girl." His friend suggested that they just fly, but he rejected the idea, because if they started emitting mana, the humans would get wind of everything and find out their intentions. And there's no telling what might happen if he used his mana. The next second, a voice called out to them from the side of the place. A man approached them and offered to help them. He was very apologetic about having overheard their conversation, but realized they were going to the city and he could help them. They were curious about who he was. It turned out that the man was a carriage driver and provided transportation services. The girl asked him admiringly if he was really a coachman, to which the man replied that he was, and demonstrated a homunculus he had obtained through alchemy. It was a beautiful creation of the 4th generation, the result of an artificial angel project courtesy of the Empire. Such words delighted our hero, although the appearance of this beast did not please the girl. The man went on to praise his animal, saying that it was very strong and docile and could fly, although it had been abandoned because it had once failed to achieve its main goal. Our heroine was curious to know why the Empire had abandoned homunculus research. The man replied that the Empire could not let such a workforce go to waste. Even now there are rumors that such animals are being mass-produced somewhere. Our protagonist asked if they were really made by some process, and not grown in giant flasks. The man replied that the young man must be joking, because about 150 years ago they made the first generation of homunculus in a similar way, but no one does that anymore. He thought to himself that it had been 150 years since Renee had been born. While they talked, the girl kept examining the carriage. She was curious how long it would take to fly to the teleportation center. The coachman replied that the flight would take 3 hours, and the check-in would take another hour, so a total of about 4 hours. And the checkpoint has to be done every time you go through all the walls. After all this talk, our heroes were curious to know how much such a flight would cost. With an enthusiastic voice and a broad smile, the man replied that such a trip would cost them 8 ounces of gold for 2. The next second, they were horrified again, and they were more than surprised, because the dungeon boss had only paid 8 ounces of silver for the previous night, and this man was asking for 8 ounces of gold. That's 800 ounces of silver, that's 100 times more. So they started going through their clothes and looking in all their pockets for some coins. And the next second, there was a kind of jingling sound in our protagonist's pocket. They were the coins that the skeleton warrior had left for him earlier. After a while, their carriage with the magic beast was already flying high above the busy city. Looking at the city from above, the girl asked him where he got such a large sum of money, and who gave it to him. He replied that it was one of his comrades. She still couldn't understand how he could move so easily as a monster. Our hero was in no mood for conversation, so he replied briefly that he had been thrown out of the dungeon. Would that answer do for her? He just wanted to sleep. It was a very comfortable carriage and their flight went quite smoothly. The girl was curious to know if the comrade he was looking for had also been thrown out. The young man answered lazily, "Yes, sort of." She envied him, for he continued to look after this man, even though they had both been thrown out. She wished she had friends like that. She would want someone to take care of her, too, and she would do it herself in return. How great that must be, she told him. Yes, of course it's great. Our hero pretended to listen to her, but he turned over to the other side and prepared to sleep. After a while, they arrived at their destination. The buildings in this city were quite different from the Empire's holdings on the outskirts. Here, the roofs of the buildings were covered with gold, and all the streets were paved with special expensive tiles. Our hero asked in surprise, couldn't they use the teleportation center now? The receptionist apologized for the inconvenience, and said that unfortunately they could not use their services today. The man went on to tell them that if they were not in a hurry, they could come back tomorrow at 8 p.m. The center is not open because the city is holding an auction today. He held out a newspaper with an announcement about the event. After the auction, he added, VIP guests will be using the center, so someone higher up will probably give permission. Our hero asked in surprise, did they close the center for an auction? The man replied that yes, because this time there was a very important item on display. And it's for security reasons, to prevent the auction from being attacked by the teleportation center. This time, something very special was on the auction block. It was Danda's teeth, 34 out of 36 masterpieces. The young man noticed that he recognized something familiar in the object. He almost shouted out the name of his missing friend, but immediately came to his senses and said that it was the same item his comrade had used. His eyes widened in surprise and a cold sweat ran down his back. He couldn't believe that this item was up for auction. He pretended to understand what the man was talking about, and assured the receptionist that this thing could be used to strike different blows. The administrator replied that he was not fully aware of the effect of the item, but that the young man was most likely mistaken. The man added that there were no more items like this, it was the only one of its kind. The only one! And in the next second, our hero had already grabbed his head, and now it was definitely clear to him that this was the weapon of the missing Renee. His partner, realizing that something was wrong with him, was upset and turned to him, asking if he was okay. Our hero continued to think to himself, paying no attention to her questions. Could humans really defeat her? It can't be, because even the bosses of other dungeons can't touch Renee. This girl is very strong, she's not just some maid with a blade. He began to remember the time she escaped from the dungeon. Did she really have a blade at that moment? No, she was wearing luxurious clothes, there was no place to hide a weapon. Besides, it was one of the daggers she threw at him when she considered him an enemy. He tried to figure out how many blades she had left. She always had at least 5 pieces with her when she encountered humans. The skeleton warrior was already strong, he had his own sword, so he didn't need an additional weapon. But here's Renee, the girl with silver hair. What would happen if you took that wonderful blade away from her? Fear gripped his companion, because in the next second, our hero began to turn into a giant monster. He couldn't control his emotions anymore. He seemed to realize that his friend had been killed by these wretched, lowly people, these little creatures. Did she really die at their hands?